Good morning, everyone. First of all, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today. We're really happy that you are here with us and we can share with you. My name is Andrea Elizabeth Madas, and I work as a program advisor at the Youth Empowerment and Transformation Trust in Zimbabwe. So welcome to this session. This session aims to outline strategies for the defense of and expansion of civic space in the context of an increasingly restricted space for independent and collective civil society actors in Zimbabwe. In Zimbabwe, civic space is shrinking as a result of both formal legal and regulatory measures and extra legal actions taken by the government and exacerbated during the current COVID-19 pandemic and concurrent lockdowns. The Zimbabwean government has put measures in place internally and has also targeted international support for civil society by, for example, hindering foreign organizations from providing assistance to civic groups and denouncing aid as illegitimate political meddling. So this question and answer panel session aims to interrogate the ways in which youth-driven, youth-serving, and youth-led organizations in Zimbabwe are responding to and defending civic space and liberties through advocacy and through the exploration of alternative avenues for engagement. We hope to focus on sharing best practices for youth and other youth-serving organizations to be able to continue to demand accountability and inclusivity in civic processes during and beyond this time. Just a logistic note, we will have 15 minutes dedicated to plenary interaction at the end of this session. Please feel free and welcome to come up with questions as we go and submit them into the chat box or verbally during the 15-minute interaction section at the end of the session. So without much further ado, I hope you will allow me to invite our esteemed panelists, Taziwa Machinawa from the Youth Empowerment and Transformation Trust, Namatai Kwekweza from We Lead, and Kudakwashe Rani Makanda from Youth Initiatives for Community Development to briefly introduce themselves at this time. So Taziwa, I will hand over to you to do that.
Thank you, Andrea, and good morning, colleagues. My name is Taziwa, and I'm a youth advisor with the Youth Empowerment and Transformation Trust. So what YET seeks to achieve is to have young people who make up the majority of the population in Zimbabwe being able to fully participate in and influence key development processes within the country, and also work towards the development of a enabling policy environment for youth participation and development. So in brief, that is the work that we do at YET. Thank you, and back to you, Andrea.
Great. Now I'd love for Namatai to give a brief introduction.
All right, so thanks very much, Andrea. So yeah, basically my name is Namatai Kwekweza, and I am a feminist, a human rights activist, and foresight practitioner. I work with a youth leadership development and advocacy organization called We Lead.
Great, thank you so much. And now over to you, Kudakwashe.
Hi, Andrea. Hi, everyone else. My name is Kudakwashe Roni Makanda. I'm a programs officer for Youth Initiatives for Community Development, which is a community-based organization that operates in institutional in Zimbabwe, that is Mutsi, Murewa, Mutoko, and UMP, with the aim to strengthen and amplify youth voices and youth participation in decision-making processes. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate it, and we're looking forward to get some insight from you on this current moment in time. So I would like to open up this question and answer session with a question directed for Kudakwashe. How have you experienced shrinking civil space in the Zimbabwean context as both an individual and as part of a youth organization? And how was this exacerbated by the context of COVID-19?
All right. Firstly, as an individual, how I have been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, and how the shrinking space has also even impacted me as an individual and as an organization. I think firstly it's because one, the liberty that we used to have of moving around, especially during when the lockdown restrictions were first effected, that also thwarted any possibility of us moving from one place to the other. And the interactions that we used to enjoy back then, with our public officials, our elected officials, and duty bearers, that also came to a halt because now they were no longer as accessible as before, you see. And so this is both at an individual and also at an organizational level. And also the fact that the interactions that used to exist prior the COVID-19 pandemic, whereby you could easily interact with your MP, you could easily interact with your councillor, that was also stopped again because of the limitations to the gatherings, the mobility limitations and the likes. And also I think as an organization as well, we realized that most of the young people no longer had that much access to information, because as an organization we're working in a rural setup whereby usually some of the information, though some do have access to internet and such social media platforms as WhatsApp, but sometimes some of them do not even have access to that, and they rely on the word of mouth. And with community gatherings being curtailed, that then became a challenge, because now their sources of information were no longer accessible, and that became also a problem because they were no longer up to date on the processes that would be going on within their vicinity. For example, if there are legislative public hearings that are actually taking place, young people would not really have access to those, because sometimes some of the information would just be communicated along a political lines, whereby only those that are the political elites of the local environment are the ones that could access it. So that also then became a challenge. Access to information also was greatly affected. And ability to access some of these public hearings so that young people could also voice out their concern, it also became a challenge as well, because for you to then be moving around, you would then need an exemption letter, which was not readily available, because you would then have to access it from a police station, of which for you to move from, let's say, your village or your ward to the police station, you would still need another exemption letter. So that alone was a big impediment to young people being able to then participate in some of the decision-making processes that would be happening within their locality. So I think that is just a summary of how this also affected the young person at an individual level. But then as an organization, obviously you would then be restricted or even be warned not to interact with the people on the pretext that we are trying to curtail the spread of COVID-19. So your programming also is affected greatly, because you are only just confined to virtual programming, which is very difficult, especially in a rural setup whereby some of the people that you were working with previously, or some of the communities that you were working with previously, do not have good internet access or even smartphone to talk about. So that then became an impediment to the work that we were doing as an organization. But I think just in summary, this is how the COVID-19 affected the work that we were doing, and also at an individual level.
Thank you so much for that, Kudakwashe. And yeah, I think that across the board, we've seen that access to information has become increasingly difficult in the last months and seasons here. Now, I would like to pose a question to Namatai. Joshua Nkomo, the former vice president of Zimbabwe, once said, "The country will never die. Its young people will save it." What do you think about this quote in relation to the contribution of your generation of youth at this moment in time? Are you doing enough?
Right. Thanks very much for the question, Andrea. So I think maybe what I would just highlight is I'm going to be talking about this from, a social, economic, and political perspective, as well as from the perspective of the contributions of individuals, as well as the contributions of organizations, particularly that are focused on young people. I think it's fair to say that the COVID-19 pandemic has, in essence, reviewed the importance of youth participation in the context of that. During the lockdown itself, we realized the importance of young people in the social, in the economic, and in the political. And I say this in the context that a lot of businesses were affected, a lot of entrepreneurs affected, a lot of the informal sector was affected, and that's mostly young people there. But what we saw was that, doom predictors, your Cassandras, had said that, the remittances from the diaspora community, which also has a huge chunk of our young people, would actually fall. But the remittances actually went up in the context of the money that was coming into the country. And we then appreciate that during the COVID-19 lockdown, it was, the economic stepping up of young people in the diaspora who are Zimbabweans, who made it possible for us to be able to sustain our economy. And I always say it from this perspective that it makes no sense whatsoever that today the diaspora is denied a voice in the economic, in the political, and certain aspects of the social elements of our society. And yet, in the context of the economic aspects, they are a major contributor. I look at it from the perspective of such issues as, human rights issues. Particularly at this moment, we have seen a lot of young people stepping up and showing up, a lot of advocacy and activism coming from young people amidst the lockdown. And even at this present moment, young people have been showing up. And we haven't seen them, particularly in our context as Zimbabwe, show up in their numbers. But we have seen an influx of young people actually stepping up regardless of the circumstances which they find themselves in. And I say this in the context that if you looked at the people who participated in the anti-corruption marches on the 31st of July in Zimbabwe, most of them were young people. If you look at the people who have been doing a lot of processes in terms of defending our democratic space, because we appreciate that the COVID-19 lockdown was actually used to advance, the interest of the political elite for them to consolidate power, through constitutional amendments, through the military. Basically, that was it. But you saw young people still being able to show up in small pockets and demand their liberties in their space. And even if we look at the abductions that have been happening, they're mostly targeted at young people because they were the ones who were showing up. We look at the community action that has happened. We look at some of the processions and the demonstrations around democracy, around food, around corruption. We also see that most of these people were actually young people who were showing up. So I think it becomes very important for us to be in a position where we understand that young people are very important, particularly in the given sort of circumstances in our context, because they have, a future ahead of them. They have the longest time to be governed with whatever arrangement is being made today. And therefore, showing up is a matter of importance. And Joshua Nkomo was absolutely correct when he said that, young people are the ones that are going to save this country, and this country will not die. I will also add on to say that we have also seen, a great amount of leadership from particularly young women. I think it's very important to appreciate that most of the activities that have been happening, whether in the economic sector, the informal sector, you talk about your vendors, You talk about all of that. And then also in the political sphere, as well as in the sphere of activism, democracy, human rights governance, we have seen young women stepping up. We have seen your Johannas, you have seen the Fadzai Maheres, you have seen Vongai Zimuzi. Those are young women in Zimbabwe who have been showing up to the front line to lead processes, national processes. Some of them have been arrested, some of them abducted and punished severely for that. So it's actually a very good dynamic in the context that we've also seen young women taking the lead. So I think it's also important to appreciate this from a feminist perspective, to say that, yes, this country will not die, the young will save it, but I also believe that the young women will actually lead these processes. Thanks very much, Andrea.
Thank you. And I think you're absolutely right that we should take adequate time to appreciate the fact that young women have been leading these processes and are stepping up and are at the forefront of this change, which will be critical in the future. Now I'd like to open up with a question for Taziwa at the Youth Empowerment and Transformation Trust. What role has a youth organization? Hello? Hi. So this is a question for Taziwa at the Youth Empowerment and Transformation Trust. What role have youth organizations like YET played in continuing to promote youth civic engagement throughout the COVID-19 pandemic and now as things are shifting again in this time of disruption?
Yeah, thanks, Andrea, for the question. I would like to frame my response in the context of Section 20 of the Constitution, which speaks to the state and all institutions and agencies of government at every level being mandated to do everything within their power to ensure that young people have opportunities to associate and to be represented and to participate in political, social, economic, and other spheres of life. So in the context of COVID-19, YET responded by providing platforms for continued engagement of young people with solution holders, with policymakers at different levels. And this involved engaging with portfolio committees in parliament, like the ministry, the portfolio committee on youth, just to update them on how young people across the country had been affected by COVID-19 from the initial stages of the total lockdown up through the various progressions of the COVID-19 lockdown levels. So this engagement also involved young people speaking for themselves, sharing their lived realities and experiences with the policymakers, with a view to having policymakers deliberate and engage from an informed perspective, informed by the lived realities of young people. We also had engagements with the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Justice, where we were looking at the parliamentary oversight over the national government response to the COVID-19 pandemic, with the view and mindset that, as Section 20 is clear of the Constitution clearly elaborates, young people participation and inclusion within the national response strategy was critical. So beyond that, we yet continued to support young people's participation in very important national processes which took place within the lockdown period. And these processes included the public hearings for the Constitution of Zimbabwe Amendment number 2 bill, which in essence seeks to amend our constitution. And we had the hearings taking place at a time when the country was under lockdown, and as Ronnie highlighted, there were restrictions in terms of movement. So the engagement of YET and other CSOs like YISID, where Ronnie is coming from, like We Lead, where Namata is coming from, was around, number one, trying to push for the hearings, to be postponed until such a time when the restrictions on movement and gathering would be lifted. And secondly, upon realization that this was not going to take place, to try and mobilize as many young people as possible across the country to attend and to speak and respond, make submissions within these public hearings based on their lived realities and how this the proposed amendments would, if affect, they have an implication on their lives. So we'd also find that another key hearing which took place during the lockdown period was the public hearings on the cyber security and data protection bill. And again, like most youth CSOs, yet was questioning, why these hearings were taking place at a time when most people either didn't have economic resources to travel or were not covered by the letters which all of essential personnel required for one to travel under lockdown. Beyond this, yet continued to use various modems for communicating with youth constituency, and these modems include radio, include even ICT platforms as a way of providing platforms for young people to engage with solution holders at different levels across the country, as a way of increasing youth influence on decision making. The radio programs were held on different radio platforms, your national platforms, your provincial radio platforms. And even if you look at the media houses used, there was also a particular bias on media houses which target young people who are resident in non-urban constituencies of this country. All this was done with a view to ensuring that the youth civic participation was not reduced or was not diminished by the fact that we could not gather physically and interact within the physical space. We also supported different youth with the youth voices to be included within the national agenda through supporting various young people who contributed news articles towards placing key issues of youth concern and key issues of youth interest within on the national agenda, ensuring that the youth voice is active and participating fully in the making of decisions that affect the young people. That will be my submission for now, Andrea. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Taziwa. It sounds like indeed a lot of work has been done despite the restrictions and difficulty of operating in this current context. Kudakwashe, I'd like to ask you another question. I know you spoke about access to information for yourself and your constituency. Around that question, or around that theme, how have youth initiatives for community development responded to and defended the civil space and liberty of youth during this time?
Oh, thank you so much, Andrea. Firstly, this Youth Initiatives for Community Development is an organization, like I clearly stated, that it operates in the rural context, in the rural areas of Mashonaland East in Motoko, where even though we say that young people are excluded from key processes, but rural young people are even greatly excluded and marginalized from key processes. So now it's very important that we also have that appreciation that these very young people that we're talking about that are from the rural areas feel very disenfranchised. They feel very excluded, they feel very marginalized. And resultingly, then there is that very element of apathy that is prevalent amongst them, because to them, they feel like they do not really have much power and authority to really make changes. And also, it's also worth noting that the areas that we are operating in are, very politically delicate areas where we have the stronghold of some very powerful political parties there who really would want to maintain that political grip in these areas. So one thing that has made it possible for the young people in these areas to remain apathetic is because, one, they have been starved from information. So that lack of information has been the reason why sometimes they have been, oppressed and failed to actually, bring their leaders to account. So what we as an organization have managed to do was, one, to further widen, that platform to offer these young people access to information. And the first thing that we did was to further sensitize and raise awareness on the national constitution, because we have understood that sometimes the reason why young people and young women are left behind is because they do not really even know what their rights are as enshrined in the constitution. They do not even know what the constitution says about what they should be getting. They do not know what the constitution is saying about how their leaders are supposed to be conducting themselves. So this is what we have done to first further the education and imparting knowledge on the constitution, especially the Bill of Rights, chapter 4, right? So that now that they have the ammunition, now that they have the knowledge about the constitution, they become enabled to demand for accountability from their leaders. They now become empowered to demand for their rights from their leaders. They now become empowered to speak up and demand for what is rightfully supposed to be theirs. You see, so that's one thing that we have actually managed to do. And then we have also done this by actually distributing copies of this constitution written in vernacular so that it becomes easily understandable, you see. And one thing that we have also managed to do, because we are working in a rural setup, there is the institution of the traditional leaders. And especially during this COVID-19 pandemic lockdown period, this institution is a very powerful institution, especially in the rural context. So they are the ones that then also are the gatekeepers also, who are also there to maintain and reinforce the status quo that is
Andrea, we seem to have lost Ronnie.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think we lost Kudakwashe there, but hopefully he will be able to rejoin us shortly, as he was making some very interesting submissions around that question. But in the meantime, I would like to pivot back to Namatai and ask for her input on how do you recommend that young people continue to demand accountability and inclusivity in civic processes during and beyond this time? Kind of what's working and what do you think will give us more critical mass with that goal?
Okay, great. Thanks so much for the question, Andrea. So I think, I'm quite sure during this time is referring to COVID-19, correct?
Indeed.
Okay, great. So what I just want to start from is the place where I say that the COVID-19 pandemic globally and internationally has revealed some of the worst governments in human history. And I think that it was important for the world collectively at one point to go through this process together, because it has helped us question our political systems, our political institutions, our economic institutions and systems, as well as our social institutions, and how these are serving the people on the ground. I think all the way from Israel, all the way to Zimbabwe, we have seen leaders being confronted around issues to do with accountability, issues to do with corruption, issues to do with what is happening with COVID resources. And I think it has helped us to really look at the ugly monster in the face and know that there are people who sometimes will, kill their own citizens. The powerful elite kill their own citizens, possibly due to, corruption. Because if you're looting COVID-19 resources and you're not developing your medical infrastructure, it means that all those people who are being affected by that particular pandemic are probably going to die. And in a very indirect way, you're actually killing people. This is actually a massacre. So I just wanted to say that it's important for us to reflect on the fact that, particularly in our context here in Zimbabwe, there was a state of emergency that was declared during the COVID-19 lockdown. And also, like, there was a lockdown, and Zimbabwe is no longer a police state, it's now a military state. And everywhere where you went, the roadblocks and everywhere, ideally we would expect to see, police officers, but we often saw that they were accompanied, by the military. And cognizant of all of this, we have to be in a position where we appreciate that this affected young people in particular, who were most likely, to violate the lockdown rules for this reason or the other. Maybe because they want to get food for their families, young women want to go and fetch water, etc. And we saw an increased number in human rights violations. We saw people getting beaten up. We saw all of those things happening. And that has been the impact on particularly young people who had to go through such experiences. And then we then saw an influx of young people stepping up to demand accountability, for COVID resources, to demand that they be food. I'm sure Joanna, Cecilia, and Netsai were demanding issues around hunger. And in as much as it might be said that there was no hunger, there are a lot of families that struggled during the lockdown, but there was no social protection whatsoever. And people were just being overtly told to stay in their households. So I think that we have to be in a position where we appreciate that this lockdown period was actually used, to settle old scores with political opponents and political enemies. This lockdown period was used for consolidation of power through the Constitutional Amendment Bill number 2. And anyone who would step up, usually the young people, they were met with a lot of force, irrationally so at that point. So I think it's important for us to be in a position where we say things like, what exactly were young people doing? We ask those powerful questions, but also become cognizant of the fact that in those very minute ways, young people were showing up and are still showing up. So I then want to say that young people, if we're going to be very, very successful in how we are doing our things, we have to first understand context. I think we've had a lot of lessons that we've learned during the lockdown about COVID-19 and how governments are likely to behave, during times of emergencies, whether it's a health crisis or, it's a time of emergency, they declare a state of emergency. Overnight, presidential powers are increased and parliamentary powers are reduced. So there's no oversight. The president can do whatever he wants. They can deploy the military. We as young people need to understand our context and also be in a position where we are able to at least predict how our governments are likely to behave in instances where there's a crisis, maybe there's a global health crisis. When we have understood this, we also need to be in a position where we understand our issues. When we understand our issues, we have to be in a position where we are able to articulate them powerfully, so that when you do engage some of these people, when you confront them, they will realize that you're coming from a place of actually knowing what you're talking about, and you're able to defend your positions. And once we have this, we then have to mobilize each other in the given set of circumstances. Of course, we have to do our risk assessments, but we have to mobilize each other. And then we have to also appreciate that our strategies will never be perfect, and we just have to do it. And we have to also appreciate that as much as our strategies will never be perfect, and if we just do it, it means that a lot of things might not go as planned because of the situation we'll find ourselves in. And this gives room for critics. It's an opportunity for people who are doing nothing, but basically want to tell you, oh, this was wrong in your strategy, but what did you do? Absolutely nothing. And we have to come to terms that this is part of the process and it's okay. And the final thing would be that we have to appreciate that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So this is how we should be responding as young people, and knowing fully well that our future is dependent upon times like these. And particularly with the issue around the Constitutional Amendment Bill number that we have been actively as an institution participating in. It's important for us to appreciate that that process had absolutely nothing to do with the citizens of this country. Because if it had anything to do with the citizens of this country, these people would have waited until the lockdown was over, because this is amending the constitution of the people of Zimbabwe. And this constitution does not belong to the executive, it belongs to everyone in this country. So we have to be in a position where we appreciate that our strategies sometimes might be very confrontational, so that you get the attention of the people who might be ignoring you at the time, but we also have to be fluid in our approach, always analyzing what is the best mode of engagement. Should we confront? Should we now reach out for dialogue, etc.? But keeping quiet and being complacent is not the way to go. In as much as there can be a lockdown, there's a health crisis, we just can't be bystanders and watch things go the other way. As young people, we have to stand, and we know that there will be repercussions to the actions that we take, but we must be willing to pay the price if our countries are going to actually work for us. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Namatai, for those insights. And I think you make a very good point there. We have to take action. Inaction just doesn't work. We have to take strategic action to address the things that are happening now while they're happening and while there's this opportunity to be a part of processes and to bring things to light. Next, I would like to move back over to Ziwa, and I've seen some chitter in the chat box around this idea too, but I specifically wanted to ask kind of how this period of disruption and uncertainty, not just in terms of COVID-19, but in terms of the wider issue of a shrinking civil space, how has it also unearthed opportunity for young people? Where can we place youth in the recovery and healing process post-COVID-19 and after this time?
Thanks, Andrea, for that. So I think the first thing is that this period, unique as it was and tough as it was, presented an opportunity for young people and youth actors within the civic space to be creative and to innovate around how they can using information communication and technology to increase youth influence within the policy making space and policy making discourse. Within the same period, we saw so many youth actors, including including ECD, including We Lead, taking an active and leading role in mobilizing young people on virtual platforms to engage with solution holders. We also saw the same youth CSOs using technology like hosting virtual rallies where we saw these common influencers or celebrities hosting virtual concerts and then using these platforms to also send out positive messaging around the young people's rights to engage with solution holders and around demanding certain actions from solution holders and holding them to account. The COVID-19 situation also presented an opportunity for youth CSO actors to strengthen community-based structures. Because within this context, the difficulties and restrictions in movement meant that only those resident within specific communities could actually continue doing some initiatives and programming within them. So what it meant was that it was an opportunity for those community level structures to be strengthened in terms of their capacity to engage, their capacity to hold community level social accountability monitoring initiatives, and their capacity to then use ICT-based solutions like citizen journalism to sort of like expose any incidences of corruption, expose any incidences, key issues of youth concern, and bring them out for the broader, public, the broader young persons and the broader community to be aware of the existence of such issues, and also generating noise around such corrupt tendencies and presence of such issues of youth importance. We also saw this COVID-19 situation providing a platform for young people to increase interaction between young people and and policymakers. Because for a time we had, some of these policymakers, for example, MPs being Parliament actually had to adjourn and they had to move back to their constituencies. And so this then presented for an opportunity for young people to actually have these policymakers resident within their constituencies and actually doing nothing else, apart from being having to respond and to assess the situation within their constituencies and responding to key issues of youth concern which were raised up by young people within their constituencies. So I would say that all those opportunities came about as a result of this COVID-19 and lockdown, and they presented platforms for young people to turn into positives which they were able to use to engage and push forward the youth civic agenda. Back to you, Andre.
Thank you so much for that, Taziwa. And I think that one comfort throughout this time has been that when nothing is certain, anything is possible. So there is also great opportunity for change when there are great challenges. So I've been monitoring the chat box, and we have a couple of questions that I hope that we can cover in the time that we have left. The first one comes from Chela Gloria, and I think I'll direct this one towards Taziwa yet, but also encourage you to keep it brief given our time limit. Chela Gloria asked, how can we be able to support those in rural areas to be part of the political processes despite their ignorance?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I believe that the first thing we can do is to be guided by empirical evidence in terms of what platforms for engagement work for young people in rural areas. In our context, we recently launched a youth situational study, youth situational analysis research study, and the study informed us in terms of what communication channels work for young people in rural areas, what engagement platforms work for young people in rural areas. And so in crafting our responses within this COVID period, we were informed by empirical evidence. And the best is we can also just ask youth CSOs which are programming within the rural context, because they appreciate more the lived realities of the young person who's on the ground within the rural context. That's my response. Back to you, Andre.
Thanks for that, Taziwa. Our next question, I think I'd like to direct towards Namatai. It comes from Etefin Okello. He says that in Uganda, as we dive into what can be termed as the worst elections ever because of COVID, which has brought in place very many restrictions, the young people are going to be affected more, most especially with the scientific campaigns, torture, intimidation, marginalization, and manipulation are highly on the rise, most especially for the opposition youth. The question is, what role should youth-led CSOs play in ensuring these irregularities do not increase?
All right, so thanks very much for the very powerful question. I always like to say that Uganda is much like Zimbabwe in many ways. And I think that the most important thing that I can actually say at young people is that we need courage that is backed by intelligence and strategy. We have to be in a position where we are cognizant of the fact that there are never a perfect set of circumstances in any situation and in any context. We have to realize that as young people, every situation brings in itself its risks. But for us to then say that we're not going to do anything because it's difficult or it's hard, that's not an option. It's never an option. So in response to what youth-led organizations, youth-led groups, youth-led NGOs can actually do, I would actually say that it's important for us to emphasize, strategies that protect, activists, human rights defenders, because particularly those are the people who keep showing up. And when we support them and we indicate to them that there is a way of protecting them, that is very good. And this way of protecting them doesn't have to be expensive, but it has to really be hinged on focusing on community buy-in to most of these processes and making sure that we reach out to the communities so that the young people who are showing up to participate have got a community base and they have community support. I say this in the context that sometimes when young people are participating, one of the things that is a very great deterrent of participation is the fear of violence, fear of persecution, abductions, torture. But when we put in place community mechanisms that sort of mitigate or reduce this risk, even though those risks never really go away, I think that's very important to actually encouraging the young people to actually show up and participate. We also need to have solidarity networks, early warning systems that go beyond just Uganda. I now believe that the problems that another African youth is facing in South Africa or Uganda is equally a problem for us as Zimbabwean youth. And we've seen this with the different movements that were happening from Shut It Down in Namibia to End SARS in Nigeria. We have seen a lot of solidarity being outpoured. So I think for us to have that kind of transparency and to really raise awareness, our strategies must not be hinged upon just the local community, but the international community. And the argument is always that the international community is not always Western countries. It can be fellow African countries. So solidarity networks at community level, but also solidarity networks at regional and international level, so that we increase the transparency and we're able to demand from around the region and around the world. I think that would be my response. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Namatai, and thank you participants for your insightful questions. Truly, if there was a moment for solidarity, the moment is now. So I would just like to wrap this up by extending a special thanks to our panelists, Taziwa, Namatai, and Kudakwashe. Please don't hesitate to get in touch with any or all of us if you have further questions or points for clarification. And we really hope that this Q&A session has given some insight into the ways in which youth-driven, youth-serving, and youth-led organizations are responding to and defending their civic space and liberties in Zimbabwe at this moment in time. Thank you so much for being here with us, and thank you for the opportunity to share with you.
Thanks for having us, Andrea, and thank you, colleagues.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Thanks very much, everyone.